Okay, I'm going to start. Sorry, everybody. I'm a bit technologically incompetent. So I've spoken before about how I think this movement is driven by sexism and homophobia, so I'm not going to go into those so much today. But just to summarize, especially for anybody, just as a recap, or anybody that's new to the issue. Basically, so you have social conservatives, and they think sexist stereotypes are innate and determined by biological sex. And then you have feminists, who think sex doesn't determine personality, and sexist stereotypes are a tool of oppression, for example, to limit women's activity and influence. And then gender identity proponents have kind of a mix of views, but basically the main ones would be that sex either doesn't exist as an objective fact, or it's not significant by comparison to feelings. And they think that male or female are categories that can be identified into. And if you do not feel aligned to either sex-based stereotypes, you can create new categories such as non-binary. So feminism clashes with both of these ideologies because they're against sex-based stereotypes. So I'm going to just talk a bit now about the profit motive. And this is very much a growth market. If you look at industry articles like this, and they've basically created a very large and new market for people who want to invest in it. And just to give you an example of the growth, in 2014, there were 50 pediatric gender clinics in North America, and in 2021, there were 300. So that's a massive increase. And you often see people, including socialists, arguing that they need these essentially cosmetic interventions to be their true self. And it doesn't, to me, it doesn't make any sense. It's contrary to what socialists used to be.
Orla, you're probably going a little bit too fast through your slides, because but that's my opinion.
Oh yeah, well, some of them you don't really need to.
Okay, fine. Okay.
I'll be describe any ones that are important. I'll kind of read and describe. So this woman I thought put it very well, and she said, "Gender ideology doesn't tell kids be who you are; it tells them by who you are." And this is a detransitioner, and that's somebody who used to identify as the opposite sex and no longer does. And she made a very insightful comment, I think, here. And she said, any form of human suffering can and will be monetized once the suffering demographic gets large enough to be profitable. And I think that's what's going on. And somebody did a mock-up of the Pride Progress flag here. And you can see it's just all the drug company logos. And these aren't minor interventions. Most children who identify as trans, if allowed go through natural puberty, would re-identify with their own sex. Most of them would be gay, lesbian, or bisexual. Trans covers a huge umbrella, really. A lot of the adult males, they'd be heterosexual. So they're not all really the same. So I think a lot of the time normal safeguarding procedures are abandoned in this area in medicine. It's quite disturbing actually to read accounts. So this is just an example, and this woman says, I wasn't allowed birth control with estrogen because as a teen I'd had migraines with an aura, a sign of high risk of stroke, but I was prescribed testosterone without warning by doctors who had this knowledge. By the age of 27 I was hospitalized 3 times for mini strokes. So that just give you an idea of the potential seriousness of the intervention. I'm just going to change this. And this is Scott Nugent, who's a woman who went through a lot of surgeries, and the surgery almost killed them. And the cost was massive because you do surgeries that go wrong, and then you have all these repeat surgeries afterwards to try to put it right. And their cost of their so-called transition was over $900,000. And she's complaining there about the kind of painting this as kind of all happy with rainbow and glitter bombs and all that. And this is an example. I think this is an Irish doctor, Sive Gallagher, and she practices in America. And she has a TikTok channel and Instagram. And to me, she's marketing these surgeries to young people. She's actually had a complaint made about her now, so we'll see what happens there. But she says here, most folks say their top surgery is easier than wisdom teeth removal. So that to me is very much minimizing what's going on. This is her here as well, again, pulling a face and saying, when a hospital tells me I can't do gender affirmation surgeries there for ethical reasons, in inverted commas, as if that's a bit of a silly reason. And this is a detransitioner. And she says, turns out my surgeon is on TikTok advertising her services. She loves talking about eating the teeth, which I guess is the professional term for double mastectomy these days. And she met with Simon Harris when he was Minister for Health in 2019. And she just tweeted this, and she says, would love to lend a hand, whatever way I can, in getting a gender affirmation surgery program up and running back home in Ireland. So I'm really hoping that's not going to happen. And this is another example of, to me, the flippancy of the attitude, although that doctor apparently was reprimanded for that. And this is again a doctor in London that does so-called top surgery or double mastectomy, birthday cake with him doing a mastectomy on it. And I just, oh, sorry, that other doctor, I get mixed up. This is actually the doctor in London. And this is a picture a patient drew for him after their surgery. And he's standing there with two breasts in his hands. And it just, I'm showing this because to me, it's a very childlike image. And I know, not in Britain, I don't think, but in America, children as young as 13 have these surgeries done on them, which is very worrying. So this is two detransitioners. And one of them, they're talking about concerns that they have, and one of them says, the amount of detransitioners in the detrans group I'm in asking if their breasts will grow back after mastectomy is so concerning. They're really doing these surgeries on people who don't know what the fuck is going on. Another detransitioner answers her and says, the first time a young detrans woman asked me this, my jaw hit the floor. She thought once she came off T, that's testosterone, once her estrogen levels returned to normal, she'd grow her breasts back. How would these uninformed young people get being cleared for irreversible surgeries? And Dr. Olson Kennedy, she practices in America, and there's a clip of her on YouTube, and she's trying to convince people that teenagers, you know, that they're fine for consenting to these interventions. And she says to me something very flippant. She said, if you want breasts at a later point in your life, you can go and get them. And of course, getting breast implants and all that, and it's more surgery, which is more risk. But I suppose it's a good business model. And this is a comment by Gail Dines, and she's not talking about trans surgeries or anything here, but I do think it's important to point and to bear in mind when thinking about this industry. And she said, if tomorrow women woke up and decided they really like their bodies, just think how many industries would go out of business. So I'm just going to talk a bit now about companies using the movement, the rainbow flag and everything for a bit of rainbow washing. And here's Raytheon with the Pride float, and that's a weapons manufacturing company. And here's another weapons manufacturing company. And this is FIFA, which of course, if they cared about gay rights, they wouldn't be in Qatar, and or women for that matter. And this person is talking about an ad that Coke produced, and they say, I think Coke casually dropped a singular they into that ad. And that reference is when some people, they don't identify as male or female, and they want people to use they instead of he or she in referring to them. And Coca-Cola says, yes, glad you noticed. We value and celebrate diversity. And somebody points out that they actually were accused of funding Colombian death squads. And this is another kind of similar example. Oreo posted out, trans people exist. And this woman said, she's a journalist, progressivism is when a corporation which has been known to use child slavery and deforest ancient parkland in Africa for illegal cocoa farming tweets trans rights. And somebody put these together, and you can see the difference between the same company, their mastheads and that on social media during Pride Month in America or Europe versus the Middle East. You can spot the difference. And this is Procter and Gamble, and they say can't cancel Pride, but apparently you can in Saudi Arabia. And somebody else, this is HSBC Bank. And UK versus Dubai, spot the difference. And as somebody wrote, happy protect your homophobic medieval theocracy profit margin month. And this is Poundland, and they say, we're proud that 100% of the profits from this range goes to Mermaids. And Mermaids is a group in Britain for trans-identified young people and their families, but they're very aggressively push, or to my mind, surgeries or well, not surgeries so much, but hormones and that, and puberty blockers for children, and they get very aggressive with people who are opposed to it. And this is the Irish Postal Service, and they had a stamp, Broads, which means pride, and some of the proceeds from it belong to an LGBT Ireland. And see, that might sound fine on the surface of it, but there are two groups that signed the letter in November 2020 wanting legitimate political and media representation removed from people who defend biology and who with other gender critical views. So I think some of the companies, they're not just trying to look good, but they're actively engaged in ideological reproduction. So I'm just going to give a few examples. So this is Adidas, and the person here on the poster is a man who identifies as a woman, and it's the first male Brazilian to get on the female volleyball team. So that's them essentially arguing for males in women's sports. And this is Wix, and these are two very political statements here. No LGBT without the T, that's like telling same-sex attracted people that they can't have their own movement without including heterosexual people, and ban conversion therapy for all, which sounds reasonable, but people are trying to compare questioning a child's desire to be the opposite sex with trying to convert somebody from being gay to straight, and they're not the same thing, because in a lot of cases, some clinicians are very worried that transitioning a child is essentially a form of gay conversion therapy, and sometimes homophobia is the reason the child starts to identify as the opposite sex. And this is very disturbing. This is Planned Parenthood Ottawa, and they say anatomy isn't male or female, it just is. That's why we teach elementary students about sexual and reproductive anatomy without using the words male or female. So that's very worrying. And this is a woman whose husband started a job and got an email about diversity training. And the first item on the agenda was be less TERF. And that's a very political statement. Like, TERF is generally a term of abuse used against women who defend women's rights, basically. And then you get some banks with this kind of thing, pronouns matter. And some of this looks innocuous on the surface of it, but it just promotes a certain ideology. And you become, if you're gender critical, then you're sort of in the outsider group. So a bank actually in the Netherlands closed down a bank account of a feminist group because trans activists complained about it. So that's the effect, you know, if the bank or the business has a certain ideology, sometimes then it leads to gender critical people being excluded from that. And this was a very political act. Large companies such as Disney, Sky, and the Financial Times, they signed an open letter calling on Boris Johnson to honour commitment to gender law reform. This was a few years ago, and the law reform was they wanted self-ID introduced in Britain, and they have a medical model in Britain. You have to go through a certain amount of transitioning or be on the way to do it to be able to change your legal sex. Now, I have issues with that anyway, but at least there's some safeguarding there, whereas they wanted to introduce self-ID, which unfortunately we have down here. So I think it's important to remember that the ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas, as Karl Marx said. And a few reasons businesses might be supporting this ideology other than directly involved in it and making money out of it through drugs or whatever. They can look good superficially and appeals to the youth market. It can potentially help them hide sex inequalities in the workplace, either by deciding not to collect sex segregated data or by allowing men to identify as women into the data. So things like unequal pay and that kind of thing, you can kind of hide it a bit if you mess with the data. It also, this ideology promotes sexist stereotypes and essentially the subjugation of women. And almost all of the negative impact of it is felt by women and children. So kind of in a way, what do they care? They might get a benefit out of it with no negative impact on the business. And I'm just posting this because to me, this is a display of power. And this is Regent Street in London. And I just don't think this gels with the idea that this is a very, very marginalized group that is cut off from, like, that the powers that be are against them or anything like that. To me, this is quite a powerful group, especially relative to the size. So I'm just going to mention a few examples of security services promoting the ideology. Now, a lot of these are British examples. So this is a Greater Manchester Police Pride Network. And they say here, we fully support this message from the venues of the village. And it says here, no TERFs and no turf. This is actually a better image of it. So again, and this is police in Scotland. And they say they received reports of controversial stickers having been placed on lampposts, and they get very excised about stickers in this area. And people were trying to find out what the stickers were. And they thought it was women won't twist, which means women won't shut up. So apparently that's controversial now. And this is an example of police. Police are not supposed to engage in overt, like, political campaigning or activity. And I know policing is political, but this is just very blatant. And to me, it shows, like, I can't see them doing this with a lot of other political groups. And I do think it shows that they have the ear of the powers that be. And this is their own Garda Síochána down here, and this is Pride 22. They even painted the car. And some of this stuff probably people would think, oh, that's, you know, not a big deal or whatever. But then you get the situation in Britain that the police are actually arriving on people's doorsteps over comments they made, and not aggressive or threatening comments, but ideological, you know, just normal comments they made on Twitter and that. And potentially we'll have a similar situation here when we introduce or change the hate crime legislation. I'll talk about that in a minute. And this is an internal briefing note of the Royal Air Force. And it says, personnel are reminded of their obligation to promote total inclusivity and total inclusivity is non-negotiable. And they even have like neo-pronouns and everything in here. And you often get Irish people being accused of being like West Brits and all this if they're gender critical, and yet you have like the authorities in Britain have been very much promoting this ideology. And this is the Ministry of Defence, and it says, the article says, officials have been told to state their preferred gender pronouns in meetings at the Ministry of Defence. And the MOD guidance claims that not all women are biologically female, and advises MOD staff to be careful using the word female in case it erases gender non-conforming people and members of the trans community. And this is 2018. MI5 got named Employer of the Year by Stonewall. And Stonewall used to be just an LGBT group, and they started campaigning on trans issues in 2015. And they're very much to the forefront in promoting the ideology and the cause. I just thought it was interesting. And MI5 then sponsored this prize for Susie Green at the same awards. And Susie Green was the head of Mermaids that I mentioned a few slides back. And this is a group for trans-identified young people. And she actually resigned a few days ago. So I don't know if there's something going on there. And MI6, not to be outdone, flying the trans flag last year. So I'm just going to mention a few examples of government and senior ministers supporting the ideology here. And these are just, I mean, there's loads of examples, but I'm just going to take a few. And this is a Green Party minister, and he says, our feminism must be inclusive of, and he has trans women there, our feminism. And this is the Human Rights and Equality Commission. And they say, we need a respectful and balanced discussion on the rights of trans people, one in which their needs are prioritised. Rights, Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission Chief Commissioner Sinead gave me in today's Sunday Post. And this was after the IRFU here banned men from contact rugby, and there was a lot of arguing that trans activists weren't happy about it at all. They wanted men to have a right to self-identify into women's rugby. And I think that's disgraceful. Like, they're actually arguing there that men should be prioritised in discussions about women's sports. And this is the Taoiseach, our Prime Minister, and she's talking about the debates over the issue. And he says, I watched it in the UK, and we certainly don't need that type of debate in Ireland. Acceptance is the key for trans persons. So we're just supposed to go along with whatever they say. And he actually says later on in the interview that he doesn't know why anybody would question what somebody says about their identity. And this is the Minister for Employment Affairs and Social Protection in 2019. And she says, trans people, especially kids, are vulnerable to lies, disinformation and prejudice. Primetime was bizarre. A complex and sensitive subject like gender identity is not best conveyed in a short, on the one hand, and on the other hand, report. And she has a hashtag solidarity. And she was responsible for putting together a review of the Gender Recognition Act. So they put together a group in 2018. And the chairperson was a trans activist, and there were 3 other trans activists on the committee, and there was no gender critical voices or alternative voices on the committee. So unsurprisingly, their recommendations aligned with what trans activists want. And it's worth remembering this document that was produced by trans activists in conjunction with the Thomas Reuters Foundation and Denton's. And I'm just going to read this out, it's quite long. In Ireland, Denmark and Norway, changes to the law on legal gender recognition were put through at the same time as other more popular reforms, such as marriage equality legislation. This provided a veil of protection, particularly in Ireland, where marriage equality was strongly supported, but gender identity remained a more difficult issue to win public support for. So they're basically admitting there that they know they don't have the support of the general public for some of what they want. And they're trying to kind of sneak laws in, essentially, before the public realises. And this is very revealing as well. The most important lesson from the Irish experience is arguably that trans advocates can possibly be much more strategic by trying to pass legislation under the radar. Another technique which has been used to great effect is the limitation of press coverage and exposure. In Ireland, activists have directly lobbied individual politicians and tried to keep press coverage to a minimum. So that tells us they have access to power, but also it's very unusual to have a campaign group or any kind of social justice group that doesn't want access to the media or that don't want to tell the general public what they want to do. I've actually never come across it in anything else, and I've been involved in political activism for years. So just to give people a heads up about upcoming legislation. So the government wants to add gender identity to the Equalities Act, and I think this will potentially move the right to single-sex spaces and possibly why it's being added. And gender identity is also being added to the hate crime legislation. Now, the hate crime legislation doesn't really define hate, it gives a circular definition. And this is their gender definition. So you can see this is a mess. Gender means the gender of a person, are the gender which a person expresses as the person's preferred gender, or with which the person identifies, and includes transgender and a gender other than those of male or female. That's just a complete mess. Makes no sense. And just to give another example of this as a top-down thing that's being pushed, this is the Council of Europe, and they say we all have a sexual orientation and gender identity. So the gender identity thing, it's like arguing that everybody has a belief in God. And I'm just going to mention here, funding NGOs is another way of how the ideology is being pushed on society. So the government say, for example, will give grants to a group, and then those groups argue for a policy that aligns with what the government wants. So it is a way of neutering. I mean, it's well known that sometimes government funding neuters opposition, and this is one way of doing it. And then the government can claim that these groups are independent experts who are advising them. So it gives them some political control of NGOs. And then you also get very rich people funding NGOs, sometimes through money fueled through foundations. So I was reading an article on Women's Place UK website, and it was an interview with people from the Dominican Republic, and they were saying feminist groups were being funded by international funders who are making a condition of funding to agree to measures gender identity proponents wanted. So I'd love to know more about how much that's happening internationally. And so you end up, when the government essentially is funding NGOs, you get the government and the NGOs coming out with the same position. And this is just an example. So again, about the IRFU decision to ban men from women's contact rugby. So the Taoiseach here, Leo Varadkar, that's the Vice Prime Minister for anybody outside of here. So he appealed to the IRFU and sporting bodies to listen to the voices of trans women, that would be men, who are being excluded from sport and impacted by their decisions, saying it's very important their voices are heard in the debate. Now, of course, they're not being excluded from sport, they're just men are being excluded from women's sport. And this is, so you saw then a whole load of NGOs tweeting out about this issue. Now this is 10-9, that's a trans group, so they're going to be in favour of men and women's sports anyway. But this is the Women Council of Ireland, and they're also coming out against defending women's sports. And they're very heavily government funded, and they even have a trans identified man, so a man who identifies as a woman, on their board. And this is another group, Empowering People in Care, who are also in favour of men and women's sport, and Migrant Rights Centre Ireland. So even groups like that it looks a bit outside their remit, and they comment on these issues. And I'm just going to mention just briefly, anti-science coming from scientists or supposed scientists. And I find this kind of quite disturbing. It's not possibly top down in the same way that some of the other stuff is, but it just shows the degree of power that the ideology and the movement has. So this woman mentions, on this day, a professor of epidemiology gave expert testimony that there are 3 types of gametes produced by humans: egg, sperm, none. And I think this is probably trying to answer people who they argue that sex is a spectrum. Sometimes you see that argument, and if you ask what's the 3rd gamete, and of course there isn't one. So I'd say that was a attempt to answer that. And in Nature magazine, which is a science magazine, an article referencing a study looking at sex-based differences in immune responses to COVID-19. The editorial board decided to put in a comment in it and said, in brackets, Nature recognizes that sex and gender are neither binary nor fixed. Now that's just blatantly incorrect. And this is Popular Science magazine, and they tweeted out, sex isn't nearly as binary as you think it is. And this woman says, I'm just a girl standing before a Popular Science magazine begging it to accept humans aren't actually avocados. And this is a doctor, and he claims it's a scientific and medical fact that men can get pregnant and also have abortions. And this, any comment like that, it just reminds me of this from Frederick Engels. Now, he's obviously not talking about the gender issue. He's arguing with anarchists here, and he says, these gentlemen think that when they have changed the names of things, they have changed the things themselves. This is how these profound thinkers mock at the whole world. And I think you could say that about a lot of the gender identity movement. And unfortunately, the right used to be the creationists and anti-evolutionists, and unfortunately that's kind of flipped now. And not completely, you still have those people, but the left now is anti-evolution and anti-biology. And these are just a few examples. So this man says, actual biology says binaries cannot exist. They violate the laws of evolution. And just nobody tell them about sexual selection. And this is Extinction Rebellion. And they say nature is queer. Trees can be both male and female and change sex. The huge range of biodiversity is echoed in human diversity. This is a scientist, and she answers them and says, Dear Extinction Rebellion, humans are not sequential hermaphrodites. Sincerely, evolution. And this is an argument about race and sex that I've actually seen quite often from the US. And this woman says, the construct of sex itself was created as an agent of white supremacy. So they behave as if the basically objective reality didn't exist. It's what we imposed on it through language. And so they think we essentially invented the concept of sex through language. So unfortunately, this is just some of my own thoughts. What I've identified as left now, a lot of the time, is anti-science, anti-objective reality, anti-free speech, anti-woman, anti-child safeguarding, anti-working class, including snitching on workers to get them fired. And not content with alienating people, they're trying to block and remove feminists from general left-wing political parties and movements as well. So just as an example, you had Helen Steele, who was a defendant in the McLibel trial, who took on McDonald's. And she also exposed the spy ops operation with the police in Britain. And they were going undercover and getting into relationships with women, and the women didn't realize, and that kind of thing. And so that's the kind of person that's being pushed out of left-wing spaces because they don't believe men can be women, basically. And so this is the Canadian socialist, and he says, and just it's like a summary of some of what's going on. If you heard about a movement that staged book burnings, hanged and burned opponents in effigy, threatened them with rape, blacklisted them from any gainful employment, and attempted to ban their speech from any forum, would you think this movement was on the right side of history? So I think part of the problem has been the ascendancy of postmodernism and queer theory in the colleges. And you've political parties kind of pandering to it in order to recruit in the colleges. That has led to a big emphasis on identity politics. Now, that's not just coming from the colleges, but it's there as well. And a lot of the arguments, one argument you see quite commonly is that people are who they say they are, except, of course, if you disagree with them, then it's you are whoever they say you are. There's a lot of focus on language. It's a bit kind of anti-objective reality, like everything is about language and perspective, and there's kind of no singular truth or objective position. And obviously, we all come from different, perspectives, and we're influenced by our upbringing and everything, and what we've been exposed to. But I do think there is such a thing as objective reality, regardless of what we're thinking in our head. And there's been a big shift from focus on economic class to identity and this idea of privileges or privilege theory, where you'll claim one person with one identity or characteristic has privilege over somebody else. And there's a degree of truth in it sometimes, but it's taken massively overboard. And I thought this was a good comment. I'm only going to read out some of it. And this person says, identity has become the axis of so much university activism because for all the radical posturing associated with it, identity politics does not threaten the established order of society. It promotes a moralistic and self-indulgent anti-politics where a person's use of language and the purity of their thinking matters more than confronting collectively the material conditions and social relations under which they are forced to live. It creates a simulation of political struggle. And I do think in a lot of ways, like the left almost, or what identifies as the left, seems almost the opposite in some ways of what it was like when I got involved originally over 20 years ago. And I do think even the left that was very critical initially of identity politics is now going along with it for opportunistic reasons. And I'm just going to give an example here. So this is Alex Kalinikos, and he's a leading member of the Socialist Workers Party in Britain. And he wrote this book, this was published in 1990, Against Postmodernism, a Marxist Critique. And this is him in 2020. And he's commenting here about Judith Butler. And she was interviewed by the New Statesman, and it was, she was making pretty poor anti-feminist comments, basically. And so he says here, and she's kind of one of the chief theoreticians, I suppose you could call her, of queer theory. And he says, whatever one thinks of Judith Butler's overall intellectual and political contribution, positive, I would say, even if conducted within an ultimately idealist left liberal framework, the way critics have responded to her lucid and careful remarks in an interview by attacking Butler's style in her more academic work is a remarkable case of bad faith. So it's just very strange to see a Marxist coming out batting for queer theory, basically. And just to give an example of how bad things have gotten in the college, I think it was I think it was 2 years ago, a porter that was working at Clare College, he was a Labour councillor on Cambridge City Council, and he resigned because the Labour was going to enforce a whip on a motion that declared trans women are women, trans men are men, non-binary individuals are non-binary. The porter, he didn't feel happy signing that, and he also defended women's rights. And then the students started trying to get him fired, basically, and somebody highlighted this on Twitter, and then somebody had written an article about it, said, as the author of this piece, they're referring to a piece in Varsity magazine, I am happy to inform you that every person cited has participated in extensive class-based activism since arriving in Cambridge, and several of us also study it. And some of us were asking on Twitter, which class are you actually acting on behalf of there? And so you get socialists now, unfortunately, who actually argue that employers have the right to fire people because they have political opinions that differ for the employers. And this is just an example, and this person is mocking Billy Bragg. So a song that Billy Bragg would sing, it's about unions, I can't remember the name of it, but who'll defend the workers who cannot organise when the bosses send their lackeys out to cheat us? And then he said this about Maya Forstater. Maya Forstater lost her job because she made statements that contradicted the stance of her employer. And I also saw socialists making comments that they didn't really fire her, they just didn't renew her contract. So they're basically almost coming out okay with precarious employment now. And unfortunately, things are so bad that even the unions sometimes are involved in trying to get rid of workers. So this was an article from the Times entitled Hard Left Academics Plotted Gender ID Witch Hunt on Colleagues. And that's what a lot of people think the left is now, is going after people at work and trying to get them fired. The article also said leaked minutes also revealed the extent to which the UCU's General Secretary Joe Brady supported those accused of helping to force out Dr. Kathleen Stock from Sussex University. That's very worrying. And unfortunately, some women have left the union over this kind of behaviour. And this woman says, this is why I'm an ex-union member. I won't support the eradication of women's sex-based rights and the sterilisation of gay and autistic kids. What a sad day for women who used to support unions. I'm just going to quote Billy Bragg again here, and I do think this could be a more wide view or perspective. And he says here, class is no longer a strong enough identity on which to base the movement. It has been superseded by race and environmentalism. You can keep shouting from the sidelines that it's all about class, but the truth is, it's just another aspect of politics identity. And I do think that's probably indicative of how a lot of people are thinking. They don't understand, like, the focus on class wasn't about identity. It was about understanding the material basis of oppression and exploitation, and understanding workers as a force for change. And there used to be an understanding of the importance of worker solidarity. And I think a lot of left now is basically idealist, liberal, and anti-materialist, and to me they're ideologically incoherent, and sometimes they're indistinguishable. If you read something without a name or group attached to it, you wouldn't know, is this coming from the government? Is it coming from like MI5 or the army or the police, or is it coming from a so-called socialist group? And this is somebody, the CIA put out ads last year, recruitment ads, and this person is commenting on it, and he says, when you can't tell if this is a recruitment ad for the DSA, that's the Democratic Socialists of America, or CIA. And quotes from the recruitment ad included, it was very much social justice warrior language, and the woman talking about herself and her role in the CIA. And she mentions, I'm a woman of color, I'm a cisgender millennial. And she also mentions intersection, that she says, I'm intersectional. And that's a reference to intersectional feminism. And which a lot of the left supports. And I just think this is James Connolly, and he was talking in 1910. And I do think this is, now obviously he's not talking about the gender issue, but I do think this is a good point that's worth bearing in mind when we're seeing so much promotion of gender identity ideology. And he says, the bourgeois press and politicians incessantly strive to inflame the working class mind to fever heat upon questions outside the range of their own class interests. War, religion, race, language, political reform, patriotism, all serve in the hands of the possessing class as counter-irritants, whose function it is to avert the catastrophe of social revolution by engendering heat in such parts of the body politic as are furthest removed from the seat of economic inquiry and consequently of class consciousness on the part of the proletariat. So basically saying like that sometimes the ruling classes, that they're using issues to distract from economic issues. And I do think that's happening here. This is a good cartoon from a few years ago. And remember the Occupy Wall Street protest, and there was a slogan, "We are the 99%," and it was massively unifying. And this is a corporate boss, and he says, "Introduce them to identity politics." And I do think that's kind of sums some of it up. Now, obviously, if the left was in a better position ideologically and everything, they wouldn't be able to divide and rule so easily. But I do think identity politics, it can be very divisive, and people are splitting into smaller and smaller identity groups. Now, I'm almost finished. I'm just going to mention a little bit about women and the political right. That's been up for discussion recently. So basically, anyone who is critical of gender identity ideology is going to be accused of being on the right, and it doesn't actually make any sense if you look at the arguments. And this is a gay man, I think he's Irish but living in Britain, and he said, "It's weird how saying women are female puts you in league with evangelical Christian fundamentalists, while saying gay people can be attracted to the opposite sex if they try hard enough." Doesn't. But there's a lot of frustration from women, especially with the left, because they just don't feel that they're being listened to, and they just get shut down and shouted down. And unfortunately, in the US, some people would argue for some, as they would see, a strategic aligning with the right, and sometimes that's over a specific bill or something. And I just think we need our own kind of liberal left perspective groups that are explicitly anti-homophobic and anti-sexist. But I just want to give this as an example of the degree of frustration people are feeling and why. If the right wing are the only ones who aren't scared to say water is wet, then what are we supposed to do as we see the flood waters rising? How much more time must we waste trying to get the correct people currently chanting there are no floods to help move the sandbags? And I just think that's a good example of the frustration. Now, I do a lot of criticizing the left on this issue, but that's because I'm coming from the left, and I think it's important to, if you see kind of your own side making a lot of mistakes, it's important to point them out. But having said all that, and something, they're generally the most vocal and kind of shouty on the issue, but it's important to recognize that these kind of laws, they're not getting passed except with complicity of the right. And for example, down here, Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil weren't supporting this. These laws wouldn't be putting through at all. And you get the Taoiseach, you get Leo Varadkar, so Taoiseach's Fianna Fáil at the moment, and Leo Varadkar's Fine Gael, like they were actively promoting this stuff. And so I do think that's important to remember, and it's important to remember things like the profit motive and businesses promoting it. Like there's actually both right and left pushing this. And I think it's important to recognize as well that you're going to get anti-feminist and anti-LGBT right groups in America coming out against the ideology for political opportunistic reasons. And I don't mean when I say this, you get individuals who have some conservative ideas, but they're interested in free speech or science, and they might start speaking up. But I'm talking about the organized political right. Like they know, they're in this fight for a reason. And this is an example. This is Matt Walsh, and he's conservative, religious American. And he said, "We've caught the left off guard with our assault on gender ideology. They don't understand what's happening or why, and they aren't at all prepared to have this conversation. They're scrambling, they're defensive, they're desperate. That's why we'll win." This is an attitude to women, and a reason that you can't really align with somebody like this. Like, just let them go off and do their own thing. Feminism is rotten at the core. Each wave led inexorably to the next. There is no good feminism. It's one of the worst things to ever happen to Western civilization. So basically, both conservatives and gender identity ideologists are gender essentialists, just different versions of it, and they both want to put women in their place, and I don't think they're allies of women. So I'm just going to finish on this note. When you have universities desperate to appease you, companies desperate to cater to you, social media willing to censor on your behalf, and governments passing laws to benefit you, you're not the resistance. So I'm just going to stop sharing now so we can see people. So hopefully people got something out of that.